go by a new ideology too. Now keep
Uh, Ken, this is one of those areas I know you love, monetary policy. And the person leading that space is the central bank governor. Now we have outgoing Dr. Njoroge, and we've just listened to Dr. Thuge during his nomination. I know you are paying attention. For starters, generally, overally, did our legislators ask the right questions to bring the right response for the country to be able to see what kind of governor is coming in?
I think they did. I think they were well prepared for that particular nomination session. And the questions, you could tell, were quite well thought through. And I think it brought out some of the things that we needed to know before. I think to the extent that we got some answers, I think it was quite useful.
All right. And one of those issues, of course, the current issues that the country is facing, the shilling against the dollar. And it's a discussion everywhere. Just earlier this week, there was, trade ministers across Africa meeting to discuss intra-Africa trade. President spoke in that forum, talked about why are we, and I'm quoting him, not verbatim, but why should we involve the dollar in everything? Why can't Africans just trade amongst themselves in their own currency? Because of the impact that we've seen with the tightening of the Fed rate. But we had to get the perspective of the governor to be. And one of the suggestions was his notion was based on the fact that people are holding dollars. First of all, was that factual?
Well, I think he's looked at the statistics that the number of Kenyans holding dollars is quite significant. But I think the assumption there is that those funds are idle. And the reality is many of those people holding dollars, many of them are importers. Many of them have a specific task to it. Many of them are importers, manufacturers. So it's not funds that are idle, just looking for returns. It's mostly funds that people are committing for particularly projects that have to do with some international transactions. I think that was the first assumption, which I think needs to be debunked. But I think even more profoundly is this appears to be a strange experiment, because what will happen when that dollar bond is floated, everybody will start looking for dollars to be able to participate in that bond. What that does, it increases the demand for dollars, which hurts the shilling even further. And it leads to what Dr. Njoroge was saying as the dollarization of the economy. Everybody now starts, even somebody who didn't have any need, somebody who is not involved in imports or exports, now will start calling his banks and demanding for dollars because I want a slice of these dollar bonds. So you create huge demand for dollars, you dollarize the economy, and you put the Kenyan currency under so much pressure, which incidentally is the same problem that you're trying to resolve, to bring some stability to the currency. So it's very contradictory, and I would recommend they really shelf that idea.
I see that. So far, in terms of propping up the shilling, we've seen also he was questioned about some of the interventions that we've seen the government involve itself in to sort of help with this dollar situation, the government-to-government fuel importation framework. He was questioned about that, and his response was the issue of time. The effect is not as immediate as we'll think, but sooner or later we'll see that impact sort of reaching down to our dollar accounts even, and that demand of the dollar. From your perspective, just looking at G2G so far, I know it's a short time to experiment this. Is it fair to give it more time?
Well, it is fair to give it more time, but at the end of the day, you are kicking the can just down the road. At some point, you still have to service those obligations. So it's depending on your outlook in those 6 months. And if you look at the dollar outlook right now, we still expect the Fed maybe to tighten one more time in the US, which might mean the currency might weaken one more time, which means in those 6 months, that obligations might even be harder to achieve when the exchange rate slips. I think when those type of questions come, I think a good response to that needs to be that we do not have a preferred point for the exchange rate. We need to let the exchange rate be determined by the market. So I think the idea that every time these policymakers talk about we need to defend the shilling, actually that's what even makes people nervous. And that's why even we find people holding dollars because they don't believe the exchange rate reflects reality. I think at all points they need to say that we do not have a preferred position. The only reason we intervene is to make sure that the movement is not volatile, is steady, and there's some stability. And where the market decides the exchange rate should be, we are open to that. That's what calms investors. But any moment you talk about now how you want to defend the shilling, it means you start creating artificial exchange rates. And people now start looking for those dollars even more because they don't believe the exchange rate that you're quoting is actually quite true. So I would have expected something along the lines of the free market. Let the free market determine. But obviously less demand on dollars would be good. But the proposals, as we said earlier, of the local dollar bond, that will actually do the opposite. It will increase demand for the dollars and contradict the objectives you're trying to cure.
When we have a new government, every nomination is thought through. And the end goal is always to help me implement my vision as a leader. And the choice for Dr. Kamau Thuge to be the next Central Bank of Kenya governor, it means his role is to help the president implement what he set out to look. And I listened to the current governor, even in response to some of these issues that have popped up in this particular vetting, nominee vetting. And Dr. Njoroge was like, we have to go back to the fundamentals. Now, first of all, for us who are down here, waiting for, MPC and post-MPC address, what are those fundamentals of monetary policy? And secondly, with the bottom-up economic model which the president wants to implement, how will the central bank play a role in that?
Well, the fundamentals of monetary policy in Kenya is price stability, maintaining inflation at 5%. I think Times Without Number have said on this show that those objectives are incomplete. You need to have a second dimension of looking at the labor market and unemployment, because inflation and unemployment have to be balanced. So Kenya hasn't gotten to that place. Our objective in Kenya is purely on price stability for Kenya. Now, how does that inform our policies moving forward? It means the central bank will continue raising interest rates until inflation gets to the targeted area, regardless of whether it affects growth and employment. So I think it's time we matured the quality of our monetary policy to have what is called a dual mandate. Many countries have advanced what is called a dual mandate, where they look at both inflation and unemployment.
Okay, wow. Let's hope with the track record of Dr. Thuge. I know he's worked for quite a long time, 25 years at the IMF. In the Kibaki era, he also worked in the Uhuru government. He also worked there. Looking at that track record, should we be expecting, what is one of the major differences that we're going to see from Dr. Njoroge's tenure?
You're absolutely right. I mean, his credentials are quite amazing. He has a PhD from Johns Hopkins, That's not an easy feat to achieve. It's a top economics program, and he's really been in the fiscal circles for very many years, so he does not need any introduction per se. He'll be following in the steps of Dr. Njoroge, who obviously came from abroad, from the IMF. I think one advantage Dr. Njoroge had was when he came from the IMF, he came from a very senior position in the IMF and could easily call the managing director and be able to do that. So I think it will be important. I think the success of a good governor right now is in the ability to buy time for Kenya, because our situation is not good. We need to be able to push back on some of these IMF policies, but to be able to push back on those IMF policies, you also need to have the muscle to do it. So we pray and we hope that you can master the muscle to push back, because if you don't push back, you can end up making a lot of concessions.
Ken, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. All right.
Thank you very much.
Ken Gishinga, Liz, as you always tell me, don't do anything I wouldn't do this weekend. We were complaining about the Thursday holiday, Friday back to work, then going for the weekend. But no more complaints about that. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Ken Gishinga, and that has been Biz Chat Weekly. That's the way we close business today. Thank you for joining with us throughout this week. We appreciate you. Have yourself a blessed weekend. Up next, we have Be With KTN. Stay tuned. I'm Melky Kumbo.